Hello, everyone. I'm Kim Mack. Welcome to the 12th event in the fall 2023 iteration of the Popular Music Books in Process series, a collaboration between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the POP Conference. Thank you to my co-organizers, Francesca Royster, Antonio Randolph, Gus Stadler, Carl Wilson, and from a distance, Eric Weisbart. On December 5th, Peter Coviello will be here to talk about his new book, Is There God After Prince? Dispatches from An Age of Last Things, published by the University of Chicago Press, and he will be in conversation with Gus Stadler. You can find the full schedule on the IASPM US website under the Journal tab, and previous recorded sessions of the Popular Music Books in Process series are archived on Eric's YouTube channel. Today, we're very excited to have Evelyn McDonnell and Ann Powers here to discuss Evelyn's new book, The World According to Joan Didion. Evelyn McDonnell has written or edited multiple books, including The World According to Joan Didion, Women Who Rock, Bessie to Beyonce, Girl Groups to Riot Girl, and Queens of Noise, The Real Story of the Runaways. She has been a pop culture writer at the Miami Herald, a senior editor at the Village Voice, and an associate editor at San Francisco Weekly. Her writing has appeared in anthologies and publications, including the New York Times, The Guardian, Los Angeles Times, Ms., and Billboard. She teaches journalism at Loyola Marymount University and lives in San Pedro, California. Ann Powers is NPR Music's critic and correspondent. Her books include Good Booty, Love and Sex, Black and White, Body and Soul in American Music, Weird Like Us, My Bohemian America, and with the artist Tori Amos, Piece by Piece. Her new book, Traveling on the Path of Joni Mitchell, will be published by Day Street Books in June of 2024. She is the co-editor with Evelyn McDonnell of Rock She Wrote, Women Write About Rock, Rap, and Pop, the first published anthology of women music writers. In 2017, she founded Turning the Tables, an ongoing NPR initiative recentering the popular music canon on marginalized, underestimated, and forgotten voices. She lives in Nashville with her husband, Eric Weisbart. After the discussion, there'll be a Q&A, which Gus will moderate. Please put your questions and comments in the chat as they come to you, and Gus will find them there at the end of the discussion. Feel free to also post comments throughout the conversation. So now I'll turn things over to Evelyn and Ann.
Hello, everyone. First, it's such a pleasure to be with my old dear friend and longtime colleague and comrade and co-conspirator, Evelyn.
Likewise.
A long overdue reunion, really.
I know. I don't know when we last did something in public together.
Oh, it's been ages. So thank you for sharing in this event. And second, I just want to say before we start, I'm looking at all the names, and I know we're not supposed to look in the chat, but this is such an illustrious group of amazing people, amazing writers, and dear friends. And I'll just single out one, Sarah Lazen. Hello.
Hey, Sarah.
Our agent, both of our agents, and sorry, my dog's here, and the dedicatee of Evelyn's book. So maybe you want to just say a few words in praise of Sarah.
Yeah, well, I mean, Sarah has been with us since the beginning. Sarah was the agent for Rock She Wrote. She's the long hauler, and she's been my agent ever since. And she helped make this book happen, and every book I've done happen. So and she is, an icon of the music journalism and of publishing. So thank you, Sarah.
Yes, thank you so much. So we are here today to talk about, well, initially, I know this was advertised as a dialogue about both of our books, and we are going to talk a little bit about my Joni Mitchell book, Traveling, but I guess I might as well share that it's been pushed back to June. It's a very long book, and it had a lot of corrections in the proofs, and so we decided to make sure everything was okay and push it back a few months. So we won't be focusing so much on Joni today. We'll have another session in May where we talk more about Joni, but we will talk a little bit about Joni, 60s icons, women whose names start with J. There are others, Judy, Joan, etc.
Joan Jett, Joan Baez.
Joan Baez, Judy Collins, etc. Judy Sill. So if any of those come up, then that's all the better. But really, we're here to focus on Evelyn's wonderful book, The World According to Joan Didion, which we were chatting earlier today and sort of asking each other, what are these books? Because both of us have written books that aren't standard biographies, that are more as much cultural criticism and memoir as they are standard, biographies. And my friend Jason Tuga had a great term called experimental biography. And I think that's a good way to describe what's happening in biography. One thing that's happening in biography now, and certainly what you did, Evelyn, that sense of a quest, that sense of experimenting, and also that sense of not adopting the voice, but like encountering the voice of your subject. And so even though this isn't my first question, I'm going to ask you about that. You say in the book, you had Joan's voice in your head, or you evoke her writing style in the book. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you came to that place and to do that.
Yeah. So, I mean, definitely this is not like your standard, authoritative or authorized biography. It would be much bigger. It's a smaller book. I can't get it in the frame there. It's not 120 words. It's 70,000 or something. So I wasn't trying to, say everything that Joan Didion has ever done and explain every aspect of her life and her work. This was more, and we both came up with this metaphor, working separately, of a kind of guide or roadmap to our understanding of her work and of how her life influenced that work, and also how the places that she lived in or visited or embedded herself in for her writing, the influence of geography, was really important in Joan Didion's work. I think it's one of the things that really defines her is the way that she was able to describe an environment that she was in, whether it was one that she was familiar with, like Sacramento, where she was born and raised, or whether it was one that she was embedding herself in, such as El Salvador, where she obviously wrote a book about during the period of the terrible warfare and massacres there. I also was thinking, reading, and I did read some chapters of Anne's book that I think are, I don't know that they're the final versions, but they are amazing, everybody. I'm sure you're not surprised to hear this. They really are just so beautifully written and so thoughtful, and just consummate Anne Powers in your ability to really think critically about your subject, but also embrace and really articulate a new understanding. And so I think of, I think of them as being critical biographies, right? Coming that we're both really trained as critics,
Right.
more than we are trained as historians, although I am also deeply interested in history, and these are also historical figures. So I think we're coming, that we both come from that perspective. I also really was thinking of how their reflections on our subjects. And I mean that both the reflections on and to some degree, I think they're reflections of,
Yes.
right? And so yes, I think with Joan, I so immersed myself in her writing. And also I've spent my writing career immersed in her writing. I mean, like so many of us, I read her in college, and it just, blew open the gates for me of understanding what you could do as someone writing nonfiction narrative prose, right? Or journalism, or whatever you wanted to call it, essays. And so there's always been Joan Didion in my work. I can look at the things I wrote in college, that show that. I think, so many of us, so many journalists are like that, but definitely by just, spending every waking moment reading and thinking about her for over a year, I certainly came to have a deeper understanding of her tools or her tricks. And I think I, used some of them myself. So reflected them. So yeah, neither of us interviewed our subjects.
Wow.
Mine passed by the time I started working on this book, but I never met Joan Didion. I thought of her as an icon. It wasn't like I spent my career thinking I'm going to write a book about Joan Didion, and then it happened, and I'm so grateful that it did.
Well, first of all, I will also say, Evelyn, your book beautifully combines your sort of your answer song to Joan's style and your own spirit. And I think you're talking about place, and one thing that comes through so strongly in the book is your own relationship to place and space and the physical world, and particularly water. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the water adventures you had. Jumping ahead of my question, but you go to Hawaii, for example, and you go to the hotel where she famously reconciled or worked through her marriage problems with John Gregory Dunn, and you also take a boat ride, and you do some swimming, and I thought that was so interesting because that is you to me. And I think of Joan as sort of dry.
Yeah, right. There is a way.
Person.
Yes, her prose she certainly has a dry wit, or had a dry wit, and yes, there's a certain austerity sometimes to some of her writing, but then also I think not. And I mean, I think that one of the things that drew me to Joan initially, and 19 or 20-year-old, was not just the beauty of her writing, and the ferocity of her reporting style, right, and of her critical thinking about her subjects, but also that she was from California. She was fifth generation Californian, born and raised in Sacramento, and spent much of her life in different parts of California. And I was born in California. I was not raised there. We moved when I was 4, but I always felt deeply attached, and eventually scurried way back to California, where I now live. So, and that was always just really important part of my identity. And I'm a third generation, whatever, it's very problematic, claiming status of being a third multi-generational Californian, because I'm not indigenous. I am a descendant of some form of white pioneer. Joan was definitely a descendant of gold rush pioneers.
Right.
And so yes, that always, and also that, I did, when I moved from California, we moved to a small town in the Midwest. So I grew up in an agrarian environment with rivers. Sacramento is a much bigger city than where I grew up, but Joan clearly was really attached to, she said that landscape shaped everything about her. And she wrote, her first book, Run River, was about the deltas. And so I think I also, and she also wrote, so incredibly about being someone from what was considered the hinterland and trying to make her way in the world of New York publishing, right? And her amazing essay, Goodbye to All That. And also she loved the water, she loved the ocean, and California was so much of her subject, and watching the sunset into the Pacific. She had her eyes trained to the west, not to the east. She didn't write about Europe, she wrote, or to the south, right? She's very interested in the global south and the Pacific Rim, and essentially the West Coast. And she wanted to be a marine scientist, and and this is I am, I live by the ocean now, not as fancy as Trancas, Malibu. I'm in, working class union town of San Pedro. Yay. just, and they call it San Pedro for whatever reason. But I do, have that ocean view, and I work with marine mammals in my spare volunteering time. So yeah, that was something really important.
And in a sense, I feel like your prose and your narrative touches her through the water. It touches her through your touching down in various places. So how did you come to plan your travel, like, and I specifically am very curious about the Hawaii trip.
Why, right, yeah, that was so I had lived, I was living in LA, I'd lived in New York, I lived in Miami, I am in Miami right now. So I knew those places that were really important to her landscape. But I didn't really know Hawaii. I still don't really know Hawaii. I had only been there once before. But yes, she's, so famously wrote, I'm sitting in a room at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel in lieu of filing a divorce for her, first column for Life magazine, which was a really, seminal, mind-blowing article. I was talking, there was a woman at an event I did the other day who was like, she just remembered reading that when it was published in 1972 or something. And just to hear a woman like putting that out in the, her marital problems in the first sentence of her column for Life magazine, and being so transparent and bold. So I thought it was really important, and also very pleasurable to go stay at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel. Also very expensive. So I stayed a couple nights and got the taste of it, and then went and stayed in my friend's free apartment. I was really fortunate. One of my best friends is from Hawaii, is native Hawaiian. Actually, she was also born in California, but grew up in Hawaii and Hawaiian heritage. And so she was also an excellent guide to the city. So Hawaii was, it wasn't, Joan didn't just go there in lieu of filing a divorce. She went there often. It was really a place that I think fueled her imagination. It's where she would either go home to Sacramento or to Hawaii to write, and stay at these very nice hotels, or rent a villa, or hang out with Maxine Hong Kingston, and their kids would play together. Yeah, I know. So I mean, there's always, there is this element of Joan Didion's life and of Joni Mitchell's life that we aspire to, right? And that we're all,
yes, that's very,
aspire
the glamour of it, but then the legend of it, like, oh, it's sort of like casts extra stardust on it or something. So it's interesting to think about how they built their own glamour. They built their own fictions, of their lives, not only in their work, but that leads to the you were talking about Joan as a truth teller, and saying things that women didn't say at that time. And I had posed this question of, both of us came up writing about more our peers, the generation of women of punk, or then later 90s rock. You were one of the very first writers to really write a lot about Riot Girl, and you wrote a book on Bjork, and your wonderful book on the Runaways, sort of the mothers of punk, and yet here we are writing about boomer icons.
I know. I had the exact same thought reading your chapters. I was like, wow, because I think when we first met, and first met Eric, like, we all talked a lot about how we weren't the baby boom generation, but we weren't quite Generation X, right? And
Right. Well,
yes,
he would be like, if he was here, he'd be violently attesting to his ex status. But
I always felt like an in-betweener, right? And like David Lowery said, what we were like 20 whatevers at the time,
right.
When we met, we were in our 20s. So yeah, it is interesting. And I think there is, and we're not writing of our generation. I feel like, and I wonder if you feel like this way too. I mean, one of the reasons that I wrote a book about Joan Didion was because she did seem to have this incredible ongoing resonance and this staying power that went way beyond the times that she wrote about, and that she was, you know, catching on with my students. You know, she was she's, you know, an ongoing meme or TikTok, and the it girl of Tumblr, as Time magazine reporter said to me the other day. So why did she have this, you know, ongoing resonance? And I guess as someone, you sort of as like an intermediary between Joan's generation and our students, our children's generation, trying to explain that. I also think like it's what you and I have done since Rock She Wrote, right? Is look back at the women who came before us, and honoring them and trying to understand them, and also then like picking up that torch and trying to carry it forward. So yeah, and I know you, I mean, you write about how you resisted to some degree writing about Joni, is, and you know, and I had an element of that too. I'm like, you know, yes, you know, it was terrible that Joan died and she was such an influence, but I was like, you know, I teach bell hooks as much as I teach Joan Didion, and you know, that book really needs to be written also. So.
Yes, no, it's very true. I think it's almost one of the most beneficial things about us taking on these subjects is that we have a bit of resistance to them, and you're fighting against the over iconicization of them, or the over reverence, that, you know, too much reverence toward them. And I think that's a really important part of your work and my work. But also there's this, in Turning the Tables, our project, we talk a lot about this too. Even women at the center of women who are closest to the center of the conversation about culture, music, writing, literary scenes are never, they're still sort of at the center and at the margin at the same time, you know. And I guess one way we described it with Turn the Tables early on was, and this was a change. I wonder if you think this has changed, and if your book enters a different time and space than maybe even when you started it, or when you started thinking about Joan. Even I'd say 7 years ago, when I started the Joni book, it still felt like she would never be number one on a list. She would always be number 7, you know, or maybe number 4, but never number 1. I don't know. I feel like, I'm sorry about the dog, you guys. I'm in a weird house, but
Pets are part of Zoom. They're an essential part of Zoom.
And so, I mean, my point being, and I wonder if you felt this like this too. Well, I'm curious if you think we are at a moment when maybe those women who were central yet marginalized are truly central now. Like, do you feel like your book enters a space where Joan Didion is at the place she should be, or is it still an act of recuperation in some way?
I think it's still an act of recuperation based on how many people I say I wrote a book on Joan Didion, and they're like, who? Which is astonishing to me. And you know, I mean, I'm obviously probably nobody in this room, but you know, not, you know, well-read people often. So I mean, you know, certainly there's been so many accolades, and you know, and certainly like a degree of hype since her death, and the estate sale was kind of ridiculous, and unfortunate in my opinion. So, you know, yes, I think there is an upswelling, a growing appreciation of her, but she is not centered yet. And you know, and this, I mean, I'm even talking like journalists and, you know, other writers and people who read a lot. So yeah, I think Joni is more there probably than Joan is actually.
Yeah.
But and I also think there's I think there's an element of both of these writers at the time, and both of these subjects at the time that that they first came into fame, and there weren't that many women writing about them, right? I mean, and Joan was one of the few women journalists. She was only one of two included in the New Journalism Anthology by Tom Wolfe. So I think a lot of the discourse about them has been shaped by men. I mean, clearly with Joni, and you should speak to this. And so I think there's something really important in us doing this.
Yeah, I think that's very true about Joan Didion. I would say with Joni, maybe half the books and maybe more now are by women. So I think that's changed. But I mean, certainly when you're looking at the contemporary, well, it's interesting. And maybe thinking about our history together, editing Rock, She Wrote and everything. I mean, there was always that sense, I know you felt it, I felt it, that as a woman, you would be assigned to write about the woman and all of that. And I actually feel like that happened a lot with Joni early on. Not always. I mean, Rolling Stone tended to assign men to write about her, but a lot of the, like NME musical, New Music Express and Melody Maker, and the English magazines tended to assign women, the Times tended to assign women. So I don't know. And actually that leads perfectly into a question that I had on my list about feminism, because one other commonality among many that Joan and Joni have is that they are or were resistant to the movement, resistant to the name, the label, feminism. You make a very good case about both her early writing and then her later writing. You can see them as feminist work. I actually sort of try to uphold the idea that Joni was not a feminist. She occasionally explicitly expressed herself that way, but I wanted to think about what it means to write as a free woman, but while resisting the label of feminism. So why was it important to you to say, which you say at certain points, but this is feminist, why was that important to you, Joan?
Because I think that people think that Joan wasn't a feminist because she didn't label herself as one, and also because of her essay, The Women's Movement, which was deeply critical of the women's movement of the time, of second wave feminism. Although, now a lot of her criticisms are considered, right on and are accepted by first wave feminists. I mean, by second wave feminists themselves. So, of course, people, I always say this, that it's very easy for me to tolerate or accept Joan's, anti-feminist feminism because I've written so much about music, and that's how so many of, our heroines in music are, right? From Patty to Chrissy to Joni.
Right.
So but the thing about Joan is that she didn't like labels, and that's what the artists always say. I think Chrissy Hynde said something to me like, I live in a colorless world, I don't want labels, that artists don't want to be pigeonholed, and it is true. Like, we don't make men say they're feminists, we don't need to make women say they're feminists, right? Or we should make them both say they're feminist. Joan always wrote about women. Women were so central to her writing. All of her novels are centered around women characters, problematic ones. But that's part of, it's not just about like presenting women as heroes, right? And she also wrote a lot about the obstacles that women face in their lives, in their careers, in their efforts to have families and have careers, and their efforts to be artistic and also be mothers. And to me, those are all feminist subjects. She wrote beautifully about other writers or other women, Catherine Hardwicke, Georgia O'Keeffe. These are some of her really amazing critical essays that are appreciating women. So, to me, a definition of feminism is that you understand the gendered inequity of our society and our culture, and that you are against it, right? And I certainly think that fits Joan and her writing, whatever she called herself.
Well, I think that there's this trope of the man's woman, the boy's girl, one of the boys, and I have a chapter in my book called The Boys. It's really about the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young circle, but really also so I'm having a senior moment. The woman who wrote Gone Girl has that whole thing, that became a meme or whatever about being that cool girl. And you were talking about how so many of our heroes in rock are these kinds of boys, girls, or like are within that framework. And I guess that raises the question, was there a point where you just wanted to like shake her and say, don't be this boy's girl? I don't know. It's like, I definitely have those moments thinking about Joni, but also thinking about women who, as a young fan that I loved even more, like Chrissy, like even Kate Bush or whoever, who you want to do an intervention on your subject, but is even that our place? I don't know.
Yeah. And now I'm going to apologize for the peacock cries in the background. Welcome to Miami. Yeah. I obviously can't, change how Joan Didion was or try to make her be someone she wasn't. And I hope I didn't do that in the book. But although I think we always, look for ourselves and our subjects to some degree. She did really rely on her husband, John Gregory Dunn, to run a lot of interference for her in the world. He was the talker. He was, oh my gosh, they're on the roof. Guys, I don't know if you can hear them. He answered the phone, Eve Babbitt's, there was a letter found in Eve Babbitt's papers to Joan. We don't know if it's unclear if Joan never got it or what, when it exactly was written, but that she really criticized Joan for this and, for being the sort of face of a monogamous, heterosexual relationship.
Wow.
There's writers who have suggested that he was even abusive to her, or at least a writer has suggested, I should say, which I don't think was true in any physical sense, but he, was definitely had an Irish temper, and could be unpleasant to be with by all accounts, when it flared. But Joan also championed Eve Babbitt's and helped Eve Babbitt's get her writing career. So she was someone who really she mentored a lot of people, and a lot of them were women. They weren't entirely women, but a lot of them were, whether they were friends or family. And she was a big advocate for Maxine Hunt Kingston and Susanna Moore and her cousin Julia Armstrong Totten. So and Hilton Nels, I think that was also a mentoring relationship. So yeah.
And Eve Babbitt herself is not exactly unproblematic. I mean, maybe this is just what we have to, this is kind of the essence of what I feel like what we have confronted. Maybe there's a way to think about it almost philosophically, or maybe the point of being a music writer, especially one who grew up on rock and roll and hip hop and in that era, is to live in the problem, and I think that's sort of what Joan and Joni both did. Like, they live in the problem, and that leads me to want to ask you, because I know you talk about, as you mentioned, the alleged, and it is just one writer who called Dunn abusive of Didion, but also you bring up her possible anorexia. I have a chapter in my book dealing with Joni and race. You will get there, but I don't talk too much about it. But, having to deal with these very delicate, challenging subjects.
Right.
And I really want to ask you both, as a writer And then just emotionally as a person, how you coped with those moments in your process.
Right. Yeah, because, and you don't want to be, and, then also, I think one of the hardest things to write about with Joan was her daughter, the death of her daughter, her relationship to her daughter.
Yeah.
Um, uh,
I'll say another parallel because you asked, was she a good mother? I had to ask that with Joni and I think of Claire Dieter writing about in her great book, Monsters, writing about Joni as an abandoning mother. I don't agree with that view, although I think Claire's book is incredible and I love the book. But yeah, like the mother question, that's
right.
a tough one. Tough one for me as a person too, and as a mom.
Yes. Yeah, no, I know. And the last thing like women need is for people to criticize their parenting, right? And
Exactly.
and ultimately, like, when many people were like, do you think she was a good mother? And what happened? And and I'm just like, well, was John a good father? Like, how come nobody ever asks that? Right? Like, and it's, I think, and from what I can tell, they both were, if anything, doting on their daughter. And yet they were both writers who would go off to their rooms and write, and there was an only child in the house, wanting their attention.
Exactly.
I mean, I think these are things all of us in the room, whatever gender, can relate to.
Yes.
The difficulties of being any kind of working person, and having children in America, in 20th and 21st and probably every century.
Yes.
But then also especially of being creative and that way in which you go back into here, and everything that's out here is, there's her daughter like pinned in the wall, the things that her mom would say to her, which is like, brush your hair and, go away, I'm working or I'm thinking.
Right.
Um,
Right.
uh, so, it's, I can't, I can't answer like whether she was a good mother or not. I know that the death of her husband was tragic, and having it followed by the death of their daughter 20 months later was, beyond what I can, and did not want to. I think that was she suffered enough.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. For
and
sure.
I can't like analyze, but I think the anorexia question, so many people talk about how
Mhm.
small she was. That's very, I never met her in person, but apparently it was just, very notable. Um, she did have some parasites that she said she never recovered weight from that, but she also talked about, having trouble eating as a child, and it being, and she said, someone trying to tell you to eat all the time is a sure way to get an eating disorder. And I'm like, which I think was her way of admitting that she had an issue. But she loved food. She loved to cook. She was apparently an amazing cook. She loved to host dinner parties. She loved to put menus together. So she wasn't an aesthetic. She
Right.
appreciated great food. She just apparently did not consume very much of it. And she wrote a lot about, it's interesting because she did write about it. She did like say, well, this is how the attitude towards eating was in my house when I was a child. And yeah, maybe it did leave me with
Well,
something.
but it's also like, again, I think it's so hard when an artist becomes a celebrity and they embody qualities that are also, or they're thought to embody qualities, they come to embody qualities that are dominant in their own work, right? And like the chapter I gave you, the sorrow chapter, where I talk about the line when Joni says, I'm so hard to handle, I'm selfish and I'm sad. And, for her, she I don't know. I have met her a couple times, very briefly. It's in the book, but I don't know her. But there's similar to the anorexia thing. There's kind of like this depression or bipolarity that runs through her music, and psychological distress, I think. And I think I guess the question that's coming out of this is the quality that you can pin to the person, the body, the human, that distresses us, or that might be a source of stigma, anorexia, mental unrest, then that's exactly what we crave from the work, right? It's like what we love, what I love in Play It As It Lays is a chapter that's 5 sentences long. That's like an anorexic chapter.
Right, right, right. Yeah, yeah. And her amazing book about a woman having has had a complete breakdown, and
Exactly.
was also had an illegal abortion.
Right.
That was the framing event of the breakdown. So very interesting. Um, yeah,
There was a question there, which I guess
Ye-
was, what is the relationship for you, or how did you negotiate? And you do it very beautifully in these chapters that are all kind of, the chapters are all like pebbles in a kind of a ritual space. You know, you have your token or your totem, snake, typewriter, highball, they're all named in those ways. So how did you walk between the person, the human, the problematic human, and the powerful work?
right, right. Yeah. So the subjects, were all things that I found recurring in her work, as well as in the story of her work, or in her life story. Um, excuse me, like notebook, hotel, building, things that she seemed to be very interested in. And it was also, that was one of the things of like reflecting her. She was also so concrete and observational in her writing. So I wanted to kind of pay homage to that. Um, uh, and so, a lot of it is how do these themes, these images in her imaginary surface in her work. I mean, ultimately, that's what I'm looking for, is how they surfaced in the work, but then also where did they come from? And that was part of like going to the places where she went, spending time in Sacramento, which I really came to love, or Hawaii or New York, and living in LA, but going up to Malibu.
Right.
And then also, I did do, and as did you, I did interview people that she knew and worked with, and family members, um, and fans, people who were influenced by her. And I also did go into archives and, look at manuscripts, letters, to her, letters from her, things that were shared with me, to sort of find the seeds
Yeah.
of the notebook,
Yeah.
of the hotel. Uh, yeah. And wanted to go back to when we were talking about, uh, writing about their bodies and who they were. One thing that you write about really well, and is so true of Joan. I also love that you call Joan her literary twin. That Joni's literary twin is great. Uh, it also has to be noted that they were both great beauties,
Yeah.
and they were great beauties in a conventional way of, thin, blonde. Um, and that doesn't make their work any less valid, but it certainly gave them, certainly it gave them a visibility. I mean, Joan is a pinup girl. Like,
Absolutely.
I mean, people have her on their walls, and
Right.
on their screens and on their tumblers. And she knew how to pose for a camera because she worked at Vogue, and she cut her teeth at Vogue. And
Right.
those images are so iconic, and it's part of how people know her. And I mean, the same with Joni.
Yeah, Joni was a teen model actually, before she got into the coffee house circuit. So, yeah, that was a really challenging thing for me. I think I had a lot of hostility about that, and sorry, and that was something. And I just, for me, and I think you do this too. Like, I had a lot of trouble starting this book. Like, I agreed to do it, and then I was like, oh, I can't do this. I think Gail Wald is here. We had one night over martinis where I was, and specifically I bring it up because I think I said to her, Gail, you can tell me if you're still here. I think I said, she's a prom queen. I've never been a prom queen. And, you know, like having this high school breakdown about this, which was ridiculous. But I had to overcome a lot of my own sort of prejudices about, beauty, centrality. I am always about the underdog. So are you. This is what's so
You love
interesting
punk?
on these
Yeah.
like alpha. Thank you, Gail. Alpha, I can see the chat. These alpha women, you know, but I know we got to open it up for questions. I want to jump ahead and ask just two brief more questions. One is, I think an important thing about this book, an important thing I hope about my book, is that we talk about the moment of iconicity and the resonances of that moment, like the impact moment, right? And maybe there were a few, but particularly the early 70s, late 60s, you know. But then you continue on and you have great writing about the Central Park jogger piece and, you know, about El Salvador and about the year of magical thinking. And I love that chapter where you deal with how she dealt with that and her relationship with Bob Silvers and what, this isn't even a question. I just want to say, I think it's important that people consider these women through the span of their whole lives and don't freeze them in the moment of the beautiful picture. So I wondered if that was something you were thinking about in your process.
Yeah, definitely. And I also I really, you know, there's a chapter called Jogger that's focused on not just the Central Park piece, but the writing for the New York Review of Books and that era, which is, you know, the era that she won the George Polk Award for investigative journalism, in which she, you know, did these deep dives into political subjects, and she covered political campaigns, and she went to conventions, and, you know, really, you know, eviscerated people like Dick Cheney, Ronald Reagan, a big, lifelong nemesis of hers. And that work is so important. And in that work, she really moved away from writing about herself. Her writing style really changed completely. She went away from having the white spaces to very dense, complicated writing, long paragraphs, long sentences. You know, you do a similar thing in the chapter that you sent me of, again, not just making this about that a woman, you know, what a woman does, and that's about a woman's emotional life and her interiority being made exterior. But you really like analyze Blue as a jazz, it's reference to jazz and to Miles Davis particularly, and you completely, it's a beautiful musical analysis and taking her seriously compositionally and as a musician. It's incredible. Yeah, I feel like that was sort of similar to what I wanted to do with that jogger. Is like, okay, this isn't just about this, you know, glamorous and then tragic and then, you know, surviving the tragedies. She also was a, you know, rigorous reporter, you know, who interrogated her subjects intellectually, and, you know, thought really deeply and made transformational pieces.
Absolutely. And we got to open it up to questions. I'll just say two things. One, yeah, and in my book, I have a really long chapter on the Larry Klein years, and I totally reclaim those albums. So justice for Larry. So yeah, I definitely think that it's hard for fans of these women sometimes to accept their own desire to change, you know, and that's actually, to me, the essence of Joni Mitchell. And maybe the essence of Joan Didion too, is that that creativity that kept transforming throughout their lives, even though they're kind of often frozen. And maybe that's the point of our books, you know?
It is a big point of my book, is that because she went through a really important transformation. She wrote about like how she had to rethink everything that she ever believed, and she had to confront you know, the whole manifest destiny mythology of her ancestor parents, and realized that this was imperialism, and was, you know, a horrible system, and what she, you know, was critiquing and depicting these empty lives of people living in these, you know, trapped, you know, existential systems. Yeah, no, she definitely, you know, she went from being the Goldwater Republican to, you know, the woman who wrote about the Central Park Five, you know, before any white publication really took on that
So,
case.
so I think we should open to
Yeah.
questions. What do you think, Kim? There goes my dog.
Yeah. Oh my God, it's been so fabulous. It's just a privilege to watch you two speak with each other. It's just, your connection is amazing. I just want to say that. I have a feeling that almost everybody in the room feels that way too. And I also want to invite people to keep adding questions in the chat. But we do have a few. And the first one comes from Candia Crazy Horse. So could you unmute and ask your question? Candia, are you still there?
Is she still there?
Is she here?
Am I on now?
Yes,
Oh, you are.
we can
Hi,
hear you
Candia.
and see you.
Hi.
Hi.
I was just curious about Anne's chapter on Joni and Crosby, Stills and Nash and Young. I wanted to know a little bit more her views about their relations together.
Well,
Particularly problematic. I know that could take a long time, but a succinct version of that is what I wanted.
well, I'm going to really talk about, I mean, that chapter is called The Boys. So I'm really talking about the Laurel Canyon scene, how Joni found a place for herself that hardly any other woman could find in that scene, and what particularly about her, I think her, well, let's say, I don't know, should I say it in the nice way? her dedication and her absolute determination to, you know, be defined and be viewed as an artist first. But also her privilege, sorry, I'm waving my dog away. Her privilege, because she did not have she had given up, she had trusted a child for adoption. She did not have a child with her, and how that was a form of privilege that allowed her to enter that space that was very difficult for other women to enter. For example, Cass Elliot, or Carole King, or Leah Kunkel, who people don't really remember that much, who was around at that time. It's interesting to think about Judy Sill, didn't have a child, but also didn't quite gain the center. So, you know, what did it take? What was required to be able to enter this homosocial environment? But then I also talk about how that, even despite, again, the center and the margin, right? Even despite her ability, for example, Cass Elliot once gave an interview where she said, she was talking about Joni and how she was always writing songs. And she said, I had a Christmas dinner once and Joni sat in the living room and wrote songs while we ate Christmas dinner. And to me, that just defines her determination to be viewed and assert herself as not domestic, you know, as that artist first. Admirable, yet also kind of fucked up. Cass is making the sandwiches or ordering them from the deli. So, you know, I mean, but then at the same time, why wasn't she asked to be a member of Crosby, Stills and Nash? Like, why not? They started
that is a good question.
Yeah, like, why didn't they like have her in the band? There's this famous video from Big Sur Festival where they're all singing Get Together and John Sebastian's on stage too, and it's great, and they're having so much fun, and you can see Stephen Stills and Joni playing off each other on the guitar. It's like, maybe she would have said no, but I know Graham Nash said many times, well, she was one of the boys, but she was also my girlfriend. So what wall came up at that with those words being uttered? That's the question. That's a little taste. What do you think? Yeah.
Oh.
What do you
Thanks. Thanks, Candia. the next question is actually from me. I wanted to ask Evelyn, do you have any thoughts about Joan's relationship to music? I, recall the Doors' presence in the essay, The White Album. It doesn't give you the sense that she really cared that much about music itself. I was wondering if that's your view, or if your view of that issue changed during the process of writing the book at all.
Yeah, I mean, and she did it, maybe it's in that essay or somewhere, say that she didn't find musicians that interesting to talk to. And and the piece on the Doors, I love it because it just captures the complete boredom of a recording session and demystifies it, even for like being with the Doors. And it was just hours and hours of like people sitting there. So, which, again, was like her ability to just, be a fly on the wall and write it all down and present it in a new way. She also wrote about Joan Baez for the New York Times, but again, like she doesn't really interview her subjects. I mean, they're so not what we think of as music journalism now. But she's describing the setting in which that they inhabit, and in that way describes them, which is probably better than, again, I think she was bored by musicians talking about themselves and their craft, and perhaps some of us can relate to that in some ways.
Yeah, I would say fair. Yeah.
I want to say
And so I actually wasn't sure if she liked music either. She made fun of KCRW as Morning Becomes Eclectic, and I think in Your Magical Thinking, which I thought was pretty funny. So she definitely had a critical ear. But I actually talked to someone who, other people did say that she liked music quite a bit, and she was very curious about music, that she didn't necessarily have regular tastes, and that she was actually fairly eclectic. And I mean, her boyfriend said that I interviewed her college boyfriend, Bob Widener, and that he remembered her listening to like pop music from the 40s, like being really into sheet music from pop songs of the 1940s. And I think that she loved music because I think her best writing is so musical. I think that that's one of the great appealing factors in her writing, is the flow and the rhythm of her writing. And I think it's very particular, and I think it changed. And I have a whole passage in the book about like how it kind of changed in time, in tune with the tunes, in tune with the times. But she didn't write, I mean, she's probably more fascinated by Hollywood than the music industry. I did find emails that she wrote with Bob Silvers, I think, for the New York Review of Books, that she was interested in writing about music, and particularly in writing about music. And she was looking at the Rolling Stone Illustrated History of Rock and Roll, and that he sent her Mystery Train. But this essay never surfaced. But I know, don't we all wish we had seen Joan writing about those two seminal works of music criticism? I mean, I hope maybe there's notes from that in the archives that the New York Public Library has.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I just want to stress that Evelyn writes very well about the musicality of Didion's prose. And I'll just say on the flip that I think I wondered a lot about Joni as a reader, and what she read, and was she into books. And what I found was she was very into like Carlos Castaneda and Hermann Hesse. And so it's just interesting to think about how your subject relates to something you love, maybe in a very different way. Not that I haven't enjoyed a Hermann Hesse book in my life, but it's just interesting to think about that. I found an account of Joni going to a talk that not Castaneda, but like his assistant or something gave, and sitting in the front row and being in like resplendent in her turquoise jewelry and everything. And it's interesting. Anyway.
And I mean, I will say that the proof of the musicality of Joan's writing is how many musicians revere Joan, have been writing songs about Joan.
Yes.
You know, whether it's Olivia Rodrigo or Andrew Bird, or what's the other album that's out now, that's can't think of it right now, but you know, and I keep hearing, you know, Margot Price.
Right.
Yeah, like all these music, Phoebe Bridgers.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think her writing has influenced a lot of songwriting.
completely.
Mm,
Totally.
fascinating. Yeah. We have a healthy amount of questions. The next one comes from Pam Thirschwell. Hi, Pam.
Hey, hi. I have to say I'm like thrilled to be here because normally I can't stay up this late, but I'm in Philadelphia and not England right now, and it's just so wonderful to hear this great conversation. I think I was so struck by that what Anne said about both of them living in the problem, but also about the like wanting to do an intervention, you know, like the other side, like that. And I guess I think my question is really sort of just asking you to expound on like what they have in common. For me, it's connected to this kind of detachment that comes in both of their works towards culture, towards men, towards heterosexuality. And also it's I in some ways I think I'm just asking you to like say some more about the feminism problem
Right.
and you know, so I was just sort of riffing on that, but thank you for the fantastic conversation.
Well, thank you for being here and being in the States. Do you want to tackle that one?
Well, I was actually thinking of one of the questions that you had wrote, but we didn't actually talk about, that I thought was really great question, is how Joan was just so industrious, right? She was so dedicated to her writing, and she was very, you know, rigorous and structured about getting it done, and it just really defined her, right? And you know, and to the maybe to the detriment of, you know, tending to her family or you know, other things. And but I actually find that very inspirational, because I want to have that dedication to writing, and I feel like that's really, you know, like I do really define myself as a writer, and but I don't do it. I also, you know, do swim and parent and have pets, but I actually feel like that's something, it's one of the reasons that people find her so inspiring, and
Yeah.
same Joni.
On that note, just of the workaholic thing, I mean, that was something I realized when I gave my manuscript to the lawyer at Day Street. One of her first questions was like, "This is a lot about Joni's boyfriends. Did you think do people talk about her in terms of her boyfriend?" I'm like, "Have you heard of Joni Mitchell? Like, are you crazy?" But one thing I realized in recounting her many relationships, and it's not just about that, is that I believe her personal life was so dictated by her utter workaholism and her studio rat reality. Like I think she might have dated one non-musician in her entire life, and she dated a lot of people. And that's about the work. Just like with Joan, being married to another writer is, you know, and having this mind meld, which you also write about so well. That was fundamentally like a person who's so driven to work all the time. Well, what else are you gonna do? So just on that note, but I would say another thing, I think they shared that. I think that they share the need. Very early on, I think Joni recognized that, well, it's not even a matter of recognizing, because that makes it sound like she was a climber or something, you know. It's just that that's who she was. She wanted to make music all the time. And so how are you going to do that? You're going to be with other musicians. And I think that, you know, both of them kind of enacted their personal lives in utter intertwined with their work and and maybe in service of their work. You know what? Like maybe. And so in that question I had asked that we didn't actually talk about, I had asked, is there an ordinary woman that they left behind, you know, that existed or that maybe could have existed? And do we care about that? So, and then connected to that, Pamela, I'll say the other thing I think they have in common is a relationship to propriety and an attraction to propriety and an equally strong attraction to impropriety. And unlike so many, I mean, Janice, for example, Holly, you know, a lot of rock icons in particular, who we think of anyway as like freeing themselves from propriety, right? There's a straight ass, you know, tight ass woman in there with these women. There's a prim side. And in the end, I think for Joni, that served her well because it allowed her, Allison had asked, okay, Frankie, go. Our other dog is home now. Allison asked, do these women write about, or did Joni think about gender? And I think she thought a lot about what it meant to be a proper woman and you know, almost an ingenue. And I think that's part of it. So anyway, sorry, I'm reading the chat. Anyway, so I think that relationship, and I also think on the final note of that, I think that has to do with their age. You know, that these are women who are associated with the baby boomer moment, the countercultural moment, but they are older than that a little bit. And they are as with every baby boomer icon, they carry with them the vestige of that previous era, and their work embodies the struggle between the mores of the previous era and then the countercultural era, and then what came after.
Great. Our next question is from Jean. Are you there, Jean?
I certainly am. Hello. I'm just, loving this conversation and also just echoing what everybody said. And I look to you two as educators for myself and as mentors. And I've always just learned so much about writing and just critical thinking about music and art in general from your work, and also a lot of the people on this call. But so what about working on these books about these titans made you better at writing?
You go first.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to study, a master of nonfiction, of the essay, of prose, was just completely inspirational, and so just sort of becoming really attuned to her tricks, and then also how she changed her writing, right? That she didn't want to become a cliche or just become one trick pony, and her writing shifted, and then it kind of shifted back later. It went from the denseness of the New York Review of Books journalism, book reviewing, then Year of Magical Thinking, like she completely went back to memoiristic, white space, fragments, very personal. So it's just understanding how you can change as a writer. And then also, again, that like a dedication to writing. And just, she would talked a lot about her writing. I think that was, and she would give these speeches at colleges, which are some of the greatest things that she wrote, were speeches she gave at universities, because I feel like she was passing the baton in so many ways. And this was also like where she really would speak about her own insecurities, about her understanding of the world and how that changed, that which she would first talk about that. I think partly because it wasn't published, and so her mom wouldn't read it. Like, I think she was very, did not want to sort of turn on her family heritage until her mother had died. And that is when she wrote Where I Was From, which is the book that she just says, hey, that's where I was from. And I understand now that I'm not from there anymore, even if I sort of look back on it with some longing. I've moved on. But yeah, just talking, offering like, even if don't feel like you can write, you got to just keep locking yourself in your office every day and eventually you will write. Just a lot of like good tools of the trade or just encouragement that, and just sometimes familiarity of like, yes, sometimes when I'm stuck, I like take all the different pieces of what I'm trying to write and arrange them on the floor and figure out how they relate to each other, or maybe arrange them on a screen now. Yeah, I think I hope that I'm a better writer now after this book.
Well, I died several times writing this book. I mean, I went through hell with this book, and I've had a hard time finding my way in, knowing what I wanted to do. I didn't have anxiety of influence about her work, but maybe about like entering into a space where there's already a lot of other writing on the subject. That was hard and scary for me. And I tried a lot of crazy things with this book. Carl saw an early chapter that was just wacky, very literary, very out there. And I had a great editor at Day Street, Anna Montague, who helped me a lot, sort of a hone and reshape this protean mass that I had created. So I guess just it was through a lot of effort. And I don't know. I mean, we'll see. We'll see if y'all like it. It's so reassuring, Evelyn, that you like because hardly anyone's seen any of it. So that makes a big difference. But so I guess just gaining courage, I've always been a writer who leaps and doesn't worry too much about those, doesn't feel like I need to gain courage because I just go. And that's the beauty of being a journalist, I guess, and being a critic for a daily paper. Both Evelyn and I have been critics for daily paper. I'm kind of used to that, like get it out and publish it. And even though I've written other books, like that's my comfort zone. So to really hone something over the course of 7 years, which is how long this book took, just the act of having to go back and rewrite. I'm rewriting a lot and going from the crazy wackadoodle, insane, literary, whatever it was, the moonwalk I was doing, to something more coherent and cohesive and narrative. Those were great lessons for me in terms of structure. And I also just want to shout out my editor at NPR, Jacob Gantz, who's really helped me over the past 11 years to be better and be better at structure and kind of not being the careless. I don't think I was ever careless, but let's say I was spontaneous. So I think in a way, learning how to be a little less spontaneous and to be a little more craft oriented was huge for me. And courage, like I said. And Sarah helped with that too. Sarah's great for when you're like, I can't, talking me out of the tree.
All right. We have a couple more questions. Are you two feeling like you're feeling it? Okay, great. Our next one is from Alice Boone. Hey, Alice.
I just want to say, like, wow. I used to carry Rock She Wrote in my backpack when I was growing up. And I wanted to say that, like, you two are both my heroes for all of the writing, especially the music columns that really show you thinking through things. I was also a huge Joan Didion fan when I was 20, and she came to my college, and I gave her an essay written about her, imitating her voice. And she just stared at me and like put it in her bag and walked away. It was a moment. But when I think back to that moment, I also think about the ways that my mind has changed about her many times since. And I think maybe not that long after that happened, her essay about Terry Schiavo came out in the New York Review of Books. And that's a complex essay. it's an essay where her writing style really does, like, that to me is a huge example of the dense writing style from that period, because she's thinking through something, and she's arguing with herself, and she's arguing with sort of like phantom arguments, and can't quite find a way to like integrate them into the text. It's such a complex essay, and it's one that maybe I return to the most because it shows her like living in a problem rather than sort of push and go on the style. And I wondered if for maybe for both of you, if there's an essay or a moment in Joni Mitchell's career where you see her like, you yourself have to change your mind because you're surprised by something, and then that lets you dig deeper into maybe what you thought about them before. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
that surprised or changed your mind?
right. Well, I mean, I would say, with Joan, there's a lot of that because she was there was a contrarian element to her. And so she was constantly wanting to push against received wisdom, which was, part of the like anti-feminism that, people think that she had because she, didn't agree with some of the things the women's movement writers were saying. And then she pushed against her own received wisdoms a lot. So, I mean, I think in Slouching Towards Bethlehem and that essay, right, that's the, core, gives the first anthology its title, the one where she embeds herself in Haight-Ashbury, and, what's supposed to be the, birth of this beautiful counterculture to the horrible mainstream culture. And, unlike so many writers of her time and of her era, instead of glorifying what she found there, she was largely horrified by what she found, but not completely, but and wrote the famous passage about acid, what was it, acid kindergarten or whatever, that they were giving LSD to young children, which, I grew up, I was a child in the 60s, but I grew up with this, belief in the amazingness of the counterculture in the 60s. And so then to read that account was, I think I resisted it for a long time. I went back and read it and really understand that in a lot of ways, again, it was her being feminist. A lot of what she was resisting was the way that women were treated in this scene, and the way the men talked about women, and that children were being not treated well because there was a complete dismantling of a family structure, and that wasn't actually good for the children in those spaces. So yeah, I think that's one that I, and a lot of people, still critique her because she didn't drink the Kool-Aid, so to speak. She exposed what was in the Kool-Aid. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I agree with you. A lot of those New York Review of Book pieces are hard to read. They are like, you can just, they can be headache inducing. They're very, very dense. It's not like the really pleasurable reading of the earlier essays, which, even if they had contrarian points of view, had such great turns of phrases, they were a pleasure to read.
I mean, for me, I don't know if I learned about writing or had a revelation as a writer, but I definitely learned a lot about music. And for example, I have a chapter on her jazz years that's called "What is Fusion?" And it was originally 27,000 words long. I lost my mind and completely went down the rabbit hole of jazz fusion and jazz funk and rock, jazz rock. And I mean, I learned so much, and I learned so much because she was always learning, and same with the 80s stuff, her uses of technology, which actually started as early as the early 70s, sampling and looping and using Moog synthesizer as soon as she could. And so I learned a lot. I think I learned a lot just about music from her. And that, but I just also want to say, Alice, that when I was a undergrad at San Francisco State, I read Mystery Train, completely changed my life. And I wrote a paper for a class about Elvis and Dionysus that I still have in the envelope that I addressed to Greel, with a cassette tape I made of Elvis songs that I thought he might not have heard. That's how dumb I was. I never sent it though. So I did what you did. I just never sent the essay to him.
All right. I think this may be the last question we have. And it's coming from Carl Wilson.
Yeah, I'll try to make this quick in the interest of wrapping up. But I was so compelled by your conversation about the generational resistance that you had to these figures, and the prom queen problem and all of these things. And Evelyn, I particularly have felt this with Didion about class over the years. And there's always been a kind of aristocratic side to her critical lens that, as fascinating as her perspectives always are, make me distrust them. And I wonder how you feel. Like, I always felt that some of her social pessimism had to do with a lack of sympathy for ordinary people in a lot of ways. And I'm just curious how you felt like you dealt with that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's, definitely something that I had to conquer also, was this feeling of that she came from somewhat elite circumstances, and certainly arrived at very elite circumstances, both in terms of married into money, and her family came into more money, and then she did pretty well herself. And yeah, had these incredible homes, and she wasn't, she didn't hide it, right? I mean, I said about the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, she would live at these incredibly expensive hotels, and they would embed themselves, and right, but they were getting, a lot of the money was coming from Hollywood, and they were getting paid to read doctor screenplays and getting paid just buckets of money at the time. And that I do not share that. That's not something that I have in common with her by any means. So I don't, though, and I think she was skeptical of people in general. She was really skeptical of movements, right? So her, against the women's movement was also against the counterculture. She just didn't really trust the idea of politics, and she didn't trust politicians. I think that she actually, in some ways, did identify with regular people or little people more than she did a lot of the elites that she met in New York, or that she saw in DC. And I think it's I can't remember if it's Political Fictions or Insider Baseball, where that's how the essay starts. She's like, when I was growing up in Sacramento, everybody that I knew, we went to river parties and we hung out at gas stations, and nobody was going to these fancy schools. And I think that's a little bit of a construct. But she was a public school, child throughout her life. She was not a private school person. Her daughter ended up going to private school, but that wasn't Joan. And she did, have this period when she was very young, where her father was in the army and was World War II, and they were traipsing around the country, and she was uprooted from everything she knew, and they were living in, the whole family was living in a one rented room in strange towns. So it wasn't always, wine and roses growing up. And then, of course, her father was an alcoholic and had mental health issues. So she was also, I think, dealing with those, a dysfunctional family to a degree. But yes, there are passages, things she says sometimes where, like including in the women's movement, where she's like, well, women just don't have to put up with this kind of behavior from men. And I'm like, well, yeah, they do, most women do have to, like just really sometimes really out of it.
Yeah.
I certainly know, some of my best friends are like complete Joan Didion haters, some of my colleagues, and so I've had a lot of these arguments, but I came to see her as someone that was really trying to critique and expose a lot of the society that she grew up in.
I mean, I think this is definitely something that's running through the critique that's happening now of the icons of the 60s in general, right? I mean, the Stones, right? I mean, Mick Jagger. I don't know I don't know if the Beatles are in the same category. Dylan's complicated around class, but I mean, whatever background especially these white icons came from, they enter a space and then they're in the elite. So, I mean, I always, with Joni didn't come from a wealthy background, but she definitely glamorized people of color, Indigenous, First Nations people in very complicated, problematic ways. We all know about the life of Art Nouveau and have a chapter, the blackface character that she inhabited in the 70s. So, but even a song like Furry Sings the Blues, where she's confronting her own being an intruder in the space of the Black blues player who she goes to visit. I think it was very difficult for her to resist the idea that that's where the magic dust was, and that she was able to walk in and grab a little of it and entitled to and welcomed. I always think about it. I think about an interview she gave about when she was young and running around in Saskatoon, and as she always claimed she was, as a teenager, would go to, she used the word brothels. I don't know, bars, something, dance halls. And in one of them, she said, and I was always safe. A clean little baby was not accosted. And I think the fact of her thinking of herself as a clean little baby in that space says a lot of both her awareness and her lack of awareness about her sort of class position and her racial position in these environments. And hey, I myself, have to confront these similar moments in my own youth. So I think it's always useful for those of us who are white and who are middle to upper class and wherever we came from, whatever class position we came from, to constantly remember that as we confront these the arrogance of our heroes, that perhaps we too possess some of that arrogance, and it's useful to question ourselves.
All right. Hey, Evelyn, Anne, thank you so much. This was so inspiring, so superb. Looking forward to the books so much. And just thank you for being here. Thank everybody in the audience for being here. Our next session a week from today will be with Peter Coviello and his new book, Is There God After Prince? So have a good night. I hope to see you, many of you, in future sessions.
Thank you, Anne, for doing this. Thank you, all of you, for being here and for hosting us.
Thank you so much. And Evelyn, thank you so much for inviting me.